Exodus chapter 16, the manna, right? The manna was also, it was a command given to Israel in the wilderness to not collect the manna on the seventh day. So the Sabbath comes into the world of humanity in Exodus chapter 16, and of course again in Exodus chapter 20. And needless to note, the Sabbath is something that resonates with creation and doesn't require really any crucial input in order for it to be holy, except that, still and all, in Exodus chapter 20, God says, remember the Sabbath day. The first translation here is flat out wrong. It's not to keep it holy, it's to make it holy, to hallow it, to sanctify it. You might be wondering, didn't God already make it holy? What's he telling us to do if God already made the Sabbath holy? And of course, the answer is precisely. God could do it all by himself. The greatest gift he gives us is he invites us to be his junior partners. I made it holy, you make it holy. But with respect to the Sabbath, it's a fairly straightforward process because God already set up shop with respect to the Sabbath. But there is an additional dimension that first we'll note pertains really across the board with respect to the gamut of living according to the Torah. This is an idea that is perhaps best enunciated in Deuteronomy chapter 17. If there arise a matter too obscure for you in judgment, between blood and blood, between judgment and judgment, between plague, lesion and plague, lesion, even matters of controversy within your gates, you shall arise and get you up to the place that the Lord your God shall choose, and you shall come unto the priests, the Levites, the judge that will be in those days, and you will inquire, and they will declare unto you the sentence of judgment, and you will do according to the tenor of the sentence which they shall declare unto you from that place which the Lord shall choose. And you shall observe to do according to all that they shall teach you, according to all that they shall teach you, according to the judgment which they shall tell you, you shall do, you shall not turn aside to the right or to the left. The role that God is bestowing, is investing in us as junior partners in actualizing his Torah, his teaching. And that has a particularly central expression when it comes to the cycle of the holy days, the calendar, because on the one hand, in Exodus chapter 12, we read, the Lord spoke unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months, shall be the first month of the year to you. Now this is critical. This is, we should note, the first commandment that God gives Israel as a nation, the sanctification of the month, which of course is critical and central in establishing a calendar. But it's not the only thing that's critical and central in establishing a calendar, because then there's another matter which is expressed in a number of places in the Torah, but we'll focus in particular on the opening verse of Deuteronomy chapter 16, because this is a commandment. Observe the month of spring and make the Passover offering unto the Lord your God. For in the month of spring, the Lord your God brought you forth out of Egypt by night. Observe the month of spring. What's the commandment here in particular? That you need to ensure that Passover takes place in the spring. And why is this so critical? It is so critical because, as you all know very well, it's kind of tough to bring the months that were the basis of the reckoning of seasons in Exodus chapter 12 into synchrony with the seasons, which are of course based upon the solar year. How many months are there in a year? Well, if we're counting lunar months, a lunar month is slightly more than 29 and a half days long. we have in our tradition an approximate count. 29 days, 12 hours, 793 1,080ths of an hour. That is a count that is recorded approximately 2 millennia ago in the Talmud, and it differs from the currently accepted average length of the lunar month by less than half a second. And we'll also note that because, I don't want to get into all the astronomy here, but because due to the tides, the moon is losing angular momentum, it may have been flat on exactly 2,000 years ago. But we'll put that on the side. That's the length of the lunar month. But you all know how long the solar year is. Well, the solar year is approximately 365 and a quarter days long, and that's not any whole number of lunar months, not even close. It's approximately 12.368. It's a very difficult number to reconcile with the length of the solar year. So what are we going to do? That's a challenge. It's especially a challenge because you can't add leap days in the biblical calendar. Why not? Because if you had a leap day, you throw off the synchrony with the lunar month. So the only way that you can maintain lunar months and keep Passover in the spring is by adding periodically not a leap day, but a leap month. So you're still reckoning months according to the moon. When the month begins, it is new moon. But there'll have to be some years that have 12 months in them, and some years that'll have 13. That essentially is the way the biblical calendar works. That's the way the biblical calendar has always worked, with traditionally the court determining on an ad hoc basis whether there's a need for a 13th month. Well, that worked when Israel resided in its land and the whole infrastructure was in place in Jerusalem. And with exile, a calendar was instituted to determine at the outset what the rhythm of the leap months is in order to keep the lunar months in synchrony with the solar year. So you probably already know about this, but just to review in case anyone doesn't remember, we have a 19-year cycle that contains within it 12 years that have 12 months apiece, and 7 years that have 13 months apiece. That is slightly more frequently than once every 3 years, there is a leap year with a 13th month. And this is one of them, which is why we did not observe Purim yesterday and the day before. And maybe I should just note here in terms of the way it works, 7 leap years in 19 years means that in 5 of those leap years, a leap year follows the previous leap year as the 3rd year. 2 non-leap years, and then a leap year. But it's not 7 and 21, 7 and 19. That means twice in the 19-year cycle, a leap year follows the previous leap year as the 2nd year, not the 3rd. And this is one of those 2 times. The last leap year was just 2 years ago, not 3. And as you can imagine, by sticking in this extra 13th month, after a lapse of just 2 years rather than 3, the result is a shift of the holy days later in the season. So, this is one of those exceptional years in which Passover does not take place on the first full moon after the equinox, the first day of spring. Passover always has to be on a full moon. That's self-evident. If it's the 15th of the month, that's the full moon. This year, Passover is the second full moon after the first day of spring. Because, well, of course, we are presently still comfortably in winter. Maybe not comfortably, but we're in winter. A month from now, when we get to the middle of the month, we will be after the equinox. Spring will have begun. But we're not going to be observing Passover. We're going to be observing Purim. So there's an offset, and it can happen. And if you ask me, well, how terrible is it when that happens? My response is going to be, not so. Because truth is that even when, on an ad hoc basis, the court would determine whether there was a need to add a 13th month. So again, we're going to emphasize, Deuteronomy chapter 16, you have to observe the month of spring. Never under any circumstances can Passover take place in the winter. It has to be in the spring. Does it always have to be the first full moon in the spring? No. It usually is, but it doesn't have to be. That is, there can be other considerations that the court can take into stride in determining whether to add a 13th month, even if the result is going to be that astronomically Passover is taking place on the second full moon after the beginning of spring and not the first. Under no circumstance can Passover take place in the winter. But if it takes place on the second full moon of the spring, that's cool. That's the way things work. And the truth is that as a result, the 19-year cycle is exquisitely calibrated because, any calendar necessarily will have a certain error margin built into it. Because you can't establish a perfect correspondence between the lunar month and the solar year. You can't establish a perfect correspondence of anything with anything. Even the Gregorian calendar, which forgets about the moon entirely, still doesn't have a perfect synchrony with the solar year. But the error in the 19-year cycle is, I don't want to get too technical here, but it's positive. Meaning that the result of using this cycle to determine the calendar is, like a year like this, that Passover can take place on the second full moon of the spring, but it will never take place in the winter. So that's basically the way the calendar works. I've given you a brief synopsis to know all the ins and outs. There are a lot of other details to be borne in mind, but that's the gist of it. That's what we do in fulfilling these two commandments. On the one hand, the commandment that this month shall be unto you the beginning of months, it shall be the first month of the year to you, and you reckon the calendar through lunar months. And on the other hand, you ensure that Passover always takes place in the spring. So you bring it all into synchrony with the solar year. So on the one hand, again, you've got the Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar in most of the Western world, and that is exclusively solar. The months are really just placeholders. There's no connection between when a month begins and when the new moon takes place. And on the other end, the Muslim calendar is based exclusively on the moon. So the Muslims just define a year as 12 lunar months. But you know what that means? It means that all of the Muslim holidays retrograde through all the seasons, because you're missing roughly 11 days per year that the holidays are going back further and further. So that's a completely lunar calendar. and the biblical calendar because of these two verses, because of Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, and because of Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 1, is lunisolar, which actually is a word if you're wondering. It's a real word. Lunisolar, based upon the moon and the sun. It takes them both into consideration because it uses lunar months, but it brings them into synchrony with the solar year. And there's an additional dimension that I need to emphasize here, and this kind of builds on what we already saw in Deuteronomy chapter 17. God saying, you're my junior partners, you got to do this on your own, because I'm empowering you to take charge of things. In Leviticus chapter 23, which is one of the principal passages in the Bible in which we read about the cycle of the holidays, we read the same phrase repeatedly. In verse 2, speak unto the children of Israel and say to them, the appointed seasons of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. And in verse 4, again, these are the appointed seasons of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their appointed seasons. And we encounter yet again the same formulation in verse 37. These are the appointed seasons of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. And we have a tradition that this ongoing, repeated emphasis on you shall proclaim them to be holy convocations is God signing off on this. You determine it. You determine it, and you set up the system that will bring them into synchrony. And as such, God says, some plane, with respect to the sanctification of time, I'm putting this in your hands. And this business about sanctification being put into our hands is in itself a major, major issue that we need to really, really soak in. What does sanctification mean? What does holy mean? Holy is a very tough word to define. Separate? Phenomenal. That's brilliant. It also happens to be what the Midrash says. Right, that holy means to be separated, to be set apart, to be removed from the mundane, but not to be removed like divorced from the mundane, because ultimately, of course, the hallmark of holiness in God's word is to elevate the mundane. But it's fascinating when you consider that we see this theme of holiness manifest in three domains. Where's the first place that holy appears as a word in God's word, in the Bible? Well, the first place is top of the screen now. It's about Sabbath. Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. He made it holy. The Hebrew, vayekadesh oto, the root of kadosh, holy. That's the first place that holy appears in the Bible. Now, I have a little bit of ambiguity with respect to the second place. This is a little bit dicey. But if we look for the second place, that the root letters Kuf Daled Shin, which is the root of holy, appears in the Bible, it is unseemly, but in Genesis chapter 38, you might be wondering, why in the world do these verses have anything to do with holy? This is referring to Judah's friend looking for the lady with whom Judah made out the previous night, okay? He asked the men of the place saying, where is the harlot that was at Enaim by the wayside? They said there was no harlot here. Now, what in the world does that have to do with holy? Probably not much, but the word for harlot here is Kedesha, which comes from the same root letters. Now, if you want to say this is completely unrelated to the theme of holiness, I get it. If you want to say, well, it is the same root letters, then I'll say, well, this is exemplifying the concept of holiness, maybe by antithesis. Of course, in a completely different domain than time. This is in human beings. We will see holy manifest in human beings more explicitly further down the road. But I figured for completeness, I should at the very least put this one in. Let's continue. Where's the next place we encounter holiness in the Bible? Here it is. Exodus chapter 3. Okay, and where's holiness in the burning bush? Very simply, look at verse 5. And God said to Moses, draw not nigh hither, put off your shoes from off your feet, for the place whereon you stand is holy ground. Admat Kodesh. So you also have holiness in space. Holy ground. With respect to the holiness of time, we see another instance in Exodus chapter 12. This is the next place that holy appears in the Bible. And of course, this is with respect to the holy days, Passover. Chapter 12, verse 16, and in the first day, this is the first day of Passover, there shall be to you a holy convocation, and in the seventh day a holy convocation. That's holiness with respect to time, again. And especially if you didn't particularly like the example of Genesis chapter 38, we'll nevertheless note that we certainly have holiness in human beings in Exodus chapter 13. Sanctify, make holy unto me all the firstborn. Whatsoever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both man and beast, it is mine. So holiness definitely appears in the context of human beings as well. So holy appears in the Bible in these three contexts: time, space, the human soul. And they aren't separate and distinct. There is a convergence of them, and that convergence is perhaps most dramatically manifest when we consider the dependence of holiness in time on holiness in space. What's that supposed to mean? Let's take it one step at a time. This is going to start out, I admit, in utter obscurity. What in the world are you talking about here? It'll become clear. Just bear with me. Let's take a look at Genesis chapter 28. Why am I focusing on Genesis chapter 28? Because of the relevance that it has to the spot of the Holy Temple. Genesis chapter 28 describes to us Jacob's vision of the ladder. Jacob went out from Beersheba and went towards Haran, and he lighted upon the place and tarried there all night because the sun was set. And he dreamed. And behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood over him, or over it, the ladder, and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon you lie, to you will I give it, and to your seed. He has this astounding prophetic vision. And I'm going to cut to the quick here. In verse 16, Jacob awaked out of his sleep, and he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. He doesn't say, wow, what a prophecy I had. He said, look at the place. It's all about the place. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. What an apt description. Gate of heaven. And of course, pay attention to this motif in the ladder. The ladder was set up on earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. Verse 12. Where is it that you can span, so to speak, the gap between earth and heaven? Only one spot. And to put it in perhaps more direct and explicit terms, we skip to another story a few centuries afterward. First book of Chronicles, chapter 21. Without going into all the details of the context, David said to Joab and to the princes of the people, go number Israel from Beersheba even to Dan, and bring me word that I may know the sum of them. And he wasn't supposed to do that. And God was displeased with this thing, therefore he smote Israel. And he tells David to choose a punishment. Without going into all of the details, David chooses pestilence. Verse 15, God sent an angel unto Jerusalem to destroy it. And as he was about to destroy, the Lord beheld, and he repented him of the evil, and said to the destroying angel, it is enough. Now stay your hand. And the angel of the Lord was standing by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Okay, now this is a summary. It's important to appreciate just in reading the narrative. Verse 16 does not follow verse 15. Verse 16 details what we saw in verse 15. It becomes immediately clear that what prompted the withdrawal of the plague, David lifted up his eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing between the earth and the heavens, having a drawn sword in his hand, stretched out over Jerusalem. Then David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell upon their faces, and David said unto God, is it not I who said to count the people? Even I it is that have sinned and done very wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray you, O Lord, my God, be against me and against my father's house, and not against your people, that they should be plagued. And the consequence. Then the angel of the Lord commanded Gad, the seer, to say to David that David should go up and rear an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And there's an old exchange between David and Ornan. David says to Ornan, give me the place of this threshing floor that I may build thereon an altar unto the Lord for the full price. You shall give it to me that the plague may be stayed for the people. And Ornan says, I'm going to give it to you all for free. And David says, nothing doing, I'm going to pay for it. And what we read in what follows, verse 25, so David gave to Ornan for the place 600 shekels of gold by weight, and David built there an altar unto the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and called upon the Lord, and he answered him from heaven by fire upon the altar of burnt offering. The beginning of chapter 22, then David said, this is the house of the Lord God, and this is the altar of burnt offering for Israel. Where is it? Where is this place? The threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Where is it? How do you know? Who told you? Who told you? Probably second book of Chronicles, chapter 3, verse 1. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father, for which provision had been made in the place of David in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And why did I share this whole passage with you from beginning to end? Really, actually, only because of one critical line. Verse 16. What does David see? David lifted up his eyes and he saw the angel of the Lord standing between the earth and the heavens. And I ask you, where can you stand between the earth and the heavens? Where was the ladder in Jacob's dream? Standing on earth with its head in the heavens? Where do earth and heaven meet? That's the Temple Mount. That is indeed the focal point of spirituality in our world, geographically. That is the Temple Mount. And it's in that vein, we have a tradition on Psalm 122, verse 3. Jerusalem, you are built as a city that is joined together within itself. Joined together, what's joined together? There's a terrestrial Jerusalem, there's a heavenly Jerusalem. And they're joined together because this is where heaven and earth meet. And truth be told, this is a theme that we see enunciated on a number of different levels. You know, when we read in Ezekiel chapter 38 of the final showdown between the forces of godlessness and God, where does it happen? In chapter 38, verse 12, this is the war of Gog and Magog. And Gog is coming to take spoil, to take prey. Turn your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited and against the people that are gathered out of the nations that have gotten livestock and goods. Just soak in the context. The waste places that are now inhabited, the people that are gathered out of the nations that have returned from exile, that have gathered livestock and goods, that dwell in, I bet most of your Bibles don't have the right translation here, the navel of the earth. How many Bibles have navel written in it? Probably not a whole lot, but that's the Hebrew word. Tabur. Tabur is navel. Where's the navel of the earth? Jerusalem, Temple Mount. What is a navel? It's a place where the umbilical cord is attached that provides sustenance for the baby developing in the womb. All spiritual sustenance comes into the world through the Temple Mount, the navel of the earth. And we should note, it's in the same vein that we can understand Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 5. Thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set her in the midst of the nations, and lands are round about her. Everything else is round about, because Jerusalem is the focal point. And of course, it's in that vein that we appreciate the metaphor of going up to Jerusalem, because from wherever you are, you go up to that focal point. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, we already saw this verse. If there is a matter too obscure for you in judgment, what do? Then you shall arise and get you up unto the place that the Lord your God shall choose. And if we ask in this vein, so who else goes up to Jerusalem? Answer, everyone. Psalm 122, verse 4, whether the tribes went up, even the tribes of the Lord, as a testimony unto Israel, to give thanks unto the name of the Lord. That's talking about Jerusalem, after all. We saw Psalm 122, verse 3, a few lines back. That was Jerusalem, that is, a city, that is built as a city that's conjoined within itself. And who else goes up to Jerusalem? Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2. And it shall come to pass in the end of days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established at the head of mountains and be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall stream unto it. And many peoples will go and say, go you and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and we will go walk in his paths, for out of Zion shall go forth Torah. Law is a terrible translation. Torah means teaching, instruction. And the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. But all the nations are going up to Jerusalem. And varying metaphors here. In Jeremiah chapter 17, as a throne of glory, on high from the beginning, that is the metaphor of going up because it's on high, but so is the place of our sanctuary. It is on high from the beginning. It is a throne of glory. And there is, of course, on the one hand, this theme of being on high, which we also see expressed in Ezekiel chapter 40. In Ezekiel chapter 40, Ezekiel comes to Jerusalem. Most important tourist ever, because he was living in Babylon. Except, of course, you know, he didn't come to Jerusalem physically. He came to Jerusalem in the visions of God. In the visions of God brought he me into the land of Israel and set me down upon a very high mountain, whereon was, as it were, the frame of a city on the south. And of course, what emerges is, what is that very high mountain? Jerusalem. He's seeing the rebuilt temple of the future. He's seeing it when the temple lay in ruins. Well, in prophecy, just as Ezekiel can be in a different place than where his physical body is located, because he's in Babylon, and in the spirit, in the visions of God, he is in Jerusalem, so too, he can be in a different time. He's seeing Jerusalem rebuilt, even though in his own time Jerusalem was in ruins. So again, you see here that motif of a very high mountain, because of course we know, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, the mountain of God's house will be set at the head of mountains and uplifted above hills. So there is that theme of loftiness, but there's also that theme of the starting point. In Proverbs chapter 8, now the speaker here in these verses is wisdom or Torah. The Lord made me as the beginning of his way, the first of his works of old. Verse 26. While as yet he had not made land, nor the outsides, nor the beginning of the dust of the world. The beginning of the dust of the world, that means it's a place that is considered the beginning of the dust of the world. Where is that? Starting point, the Temple Mount. And we see the same motif in Psalm 50. A psalm of Asaph, God the Lord has spoken and called the earth from the rising sun unto the going down thereof. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God has shined forth. Out of Zion. It all comes out of Zion. That's the starting point. And we'll note likewise, Isaiah chapter 28, verse 16. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a fortress stone, a costly cornerstone, of sure foundation. He that believes shall not make haste. The story of the foundation stone. Now, we talked about this last year, some of you may recall, but I think it's important for us to recall this at this juncture as well because it's relevant. You're still wondering how it's relevant to the calendar. We're getting there. It is relevant. With respect to the foundation stone, the Mishnah, post-biblical, tells us that once the ark was taken with the destruction of the first temple, a stone was there in the Holy of Holies from the days of the early prophets, referring to David and Samuel who laid the groundwork of the temple. And it was called Shetiyah, which is Hebrew for foundation. 3 finger breadths higher than the ground, and upon it the high priest would place the censer to offer incense on the Day of Atonement, as we read in Leviticus chapter 16, verses 12 and 13. The ark wasn't there. When the ark was there, he would place it between the staves of the ark. When it wasn't there, he placed it on the foundation stone. And what do we mean by foundation stone? The Talmud, in attempting to elucidate what this foundation stone means, tells us it was called foundation, for from it the world was founded. And the elaboration on the verses that we just saw, commenting on Psalm 50, verse 2, out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God has shined forth, means the perfection of the world's beauty is out of Zion, for from it the world was created. And likewise, the words of Isaiah chapter 28, verse 16, therefore thus says the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation, a stone, foundation stone. The stone in Zion was the cornerstone and foundation of all the world. Now, what in the world is that supposed to mean? If we were flat earthers, then you could figure out what the starting point would be very simply. Just like imagine God like plopping down this lump of dough and getting out his cosmic rolling pin and rolling out the world from there. But we're not flat earthers. I hope we're not flat earthers. So what do we mean when we talk about the foundation stone as the place from which the earth was founded, the world, the universe was founded? And I shared this idea last year, but I'm going to reiterate it again. When we conceive of the manner in which God creates the universe, obviously in God's realm, there's no such thing as physicality, complete transcendence. In our realm, there is physicality. There's a series of, let's call them emanations from God. that ultimately produce this world. There is a point at which physicality begins. We could maybe think about it as a phase transition, the initial point of physicality. That point is the foundation stone. That means on the other side of the foundation stone, and when I say the other side, I don't mean north side, south side, east side, or west side, I mean inside. There's no physicality. Complete transcendence. That's the identity of the foundation stone and its essential significance. This is the place where spirituality flows out into our physical universe. And that is precisely the reason this is so relevant with respect to the sanctification of time and the formulation of the biblical calendar. And it all boils down in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3, which I know we already saw, to the last sentence here. For out of Zion shall go forth teaching, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So we have a venerable tradition that since out of Zion goes forth teaching, the word of God from Jerusalem, therefore, the calendar goes forth specifically from there. It is in Zion that sanctification of the month takes place, that the inculcation of years takes place. And by tradition, that was always the case. That the court convened in the precincts of the Holy Temple was the court that received the eyewitnesses who testified to having seen the faintest sliver of the waxing crescent moon to serve as the harbinger that it was time to declare the new month. Because sanctification of time is rooted in sanctification of space. Hallowed space. We talk about hallowed space. The first example of hallowed space, as we noted, was the burning bush, Mount Sinai. That's transient. That holiness is here today, gone tomorrow. As God says to Moses, when the shofar sounds its long blast, then the people can go up the mountain. Business as usual. The mountain has returned to its perfectly mundane status. It doesn't maintain the extraordinary sanctity that it had when God revealed his word on Mount Sinai. Not so the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is forever. That holiness is, again, the focal point, the point of emanation of holiness for the entire world. So the holiness of time is rooted in the holiness of space. From Zion goes forth Torah, goes forth teaching, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And that brings me to an additional dimension that I'd like to share with you with respect to what that tells us about the calendar. What that tells us about the calendar, and maybe even more specifically, what it tells us about this institution, which we call in Hebrew Rosh Chodesh. Literally, the head of the month. The beginning of the month. Of what significance is Rosh Chodesh in biblical holy days? Maybe before I continue, are there any comments or questions on what we've discussed so far? Because if there are, yes, please. Yes? You're talking about this year or in general? No, so again, the anchor for bringing the lunar calendar and the solar calendar into synchrony is Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 1, not about the fall, about the spring. Passover has to always take place in the spring. It was what God ordains, as he expresses it in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 1. The Feast of Tabernacles always takes place in the fall. No exceptions to that. We would say that given what God has dictated, what happens in heaven reflects what God's junior partners do on earth. He says, this is your job. You do it. You mean Isaiah chapter 2? That's a great question. I think we appreciate that Micah has, in that vein, a very similar agenda to Isaiah in giving us this vision of Jerusalem being the beacon for the entire world. Look, the truth is that the basic idea is something we see in other prophets as well. It's glaring that Micah chapter 4 is almost identical with Isaiah chapter 2. You're right, but it's only for those three verses. Afterwards, there's divergence. So he's taking it in a different direction, so to speak. That is, Micah takes it in the direction of everyone sitting beneath his fig tree and his vine. That's also an important element here. Yes? You mean with respect to Passover? Absolutely. That is, of course, we appreciate that the reason... So, of course, the harvest doesn't take place in one felled swoop on a particular day. There's a ripening process. We will appreciate that in all agricultural produce. That is, the whole focus on what is instituted by Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 1, what God says that you have to keep the month of spring and make Passover is what will ensure the synchrony of the agricultural year. After all, the agricultural year follows the seasons. So the seasons will dictate when the produce ripens, the barley harvest, the wheat harvest. We know that sequence of harvests as we read it in the second chapter of the book of Ruth. And the imperative to make sure that Passover is taking place when it does, in itself ensures that there's going to be a synchrony with the agricultural year.
It's also critical for the next week, which is the Feast of First Fruits.
Of course, sure.
You can't offer unripened harvest.
You're right. Well, on the Feast of the First Fruits, it's going to be the wheat that's already becoming ripe. But 100%, the whole sequence is going to depend upon synchrony with the seasons. The barley ripens on Passover. It's the wheat that ripens before Pentecost. Right. That's Pentecost. That's Shavuot. That's when the wheat is ripening. The special offering brought in the Holy Temple on Shavuot, on the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, is explicitly specified in Leviticus chapter 23 as coming from solet, fine wheat flour. So there's a special barley offering that is brought on the second day of Passover, and the loaves that are prepared from fine wheat flour for Pentecost. Right. That's a different story. We can't put in too many stories here because otherwise people will just... Okay, but the basic structure, again, is the agricultural sequence is going to follow the solar year, and the solar year is kept in synchrony with the calendar. And I guess at this point we should probably take a break because it's roughly time for that. So we'll reconvene to consider a fascinating, developing crescendo with respect to the significance of the new moon. So on that note, God willing, we'll continue. Can't possibly interrupt, because if you have something to say, it's not an interruption. So please make it more interactive. I was hearing myself speak too much and I was starting to get really bored. So, okay, so please help me out. Make things more interesting, okay? Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a little 15-minute buddy break, as well as if you go through this room, there's some snacks, there's coffee, there's hot tea. So we'll take about a 15-minute break, and we'll be right back at it.
Okay.
All right, let's come together again, and Chaim's going to teach another hour from 1:15 to 2:15, and then we'll take another 15-minute break and come back again.
Amen.
Chaim Eisen, yay!
But I feel badly that I didn't emphasize enough that we want this to be interactive. So please make it interactive, okay? I don't want to hear myself droning on and on and on too much, okay? So please be interactive. And I'm just going to call everyone's attention. There are 3 handouts back there. Pastor Mark put it out. One is a brochure about the services that our ministry offers. Another is a short essay about the context and purpose of my mission to build bridges by tearing down walls between Jews and Christians. And another is a single sheet that has contact information, especially for the services that we have for pilgrims coming to Israel. So please take all 3. And if you have a bunch of people who you think would be interested in them, take enough for each and every one of them, okay? It means I won't have to carry that many more with me. Okay. So next installment, we were going to talk about what the significance is of Rosh Chodesh, of the celebration, the holy day that pertains to the new moon. And what's fascinating here is it's a moving target. It's not something that remains static over the course of history. If we look in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, we see Rosh Chodesh appearing only twice. I don't mean giving a date. I mean as a day that needs to be observed. The first place is Numbers chapter 10. Also in the day of your gladness and in your appointed seasons and in your new moons, you shall blow with trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, and they shall be for you a memorial before your Lord. I am the Lord your God. So the new moons occasions a special celebration together with the appointed seasons. The other context in which we read about the new moon is in Numbers chapter 28, when we read about the special additional offerings brought in the Holy Temple on all the special days of the year, and just after the Sabbath. They're the weekday offerings, the Sabbath offerings, and in your new moon you shall present the burnt offering unto the Lord, and there's a list of exactly what is included in that offering. So it is a special day, but that's all we have to read about it. We do fast forward into the prophets. And in the first book of Samuel, chapter 20, we read of the significance of the new moon as a day upon which there is some very special festive meal, certainly for the king. And David said unto Jonathan, behold, tomorrow is the new moon, when I should sit with the king to eat. So let me go that I may hide myself in the field unto the 3rd day at evening, because I'm convinced the king wants to kill me. And indeed, several verses afterward, Jonathan said unto him, tomorrow is the new moon, you will be missed, your seat will be empty. Clearly there was a special protocol for the festive meal that was eaten on the new moon. It's not in the 5 books of Moses, but it was clearly observed in the time of the prophets. Something else in the time of the prophets. This is tantalizing. You all remember the story of the Shunammite woman in the 2nd book of Kings, chapter 4. And Elisha, the prophet, promises her that she'll have a child after so many years of barrenness, and the child dies. And she places his body upon the bed of Elisha, and she wants to go to Elisha to ask for his intercession with God. And she called unto her husband and said, send me, I pray you, one of the servants and one of the asses, that I may run to the man of God and come back. She doesn't tell him what it's about. And he said, why do you want to go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath. Neither new moon nor Sabbath. That implies that on the new moons, like on the Sabbath, they would go to visit the resident prophets. Right? Why are you going to him if it's not a new moon and not a Sabbath? That implies that on the new moons they would go to visit the prophet. So there's also an observance that takes place, of which we read nothing in the five books of Moses, that evidently was associated with the new moon. Now, truth be told, we read about the new moon in a very different way in several of the prophets. And this isn't pleasant. It's an indictment. In Isaiah chapter 1, bring no more vain oblations. It is an offering of abomination unto me. New moon and Sabbath, the holding of convocations. I cannot endure iniquity along with the solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed seasons my soul hates. They are a burden unto me. These were special days. But what are you doing on them? In Amos chapter 8, hear this, O you that would swallow the needy and destroy the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be gone that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may set forth corn? Evidently, on the new moon, at least in part, they refrained from engaging in business. Again, a special observance of the new moon, of which we read nothing in the five books of Moses. And, of course, the consequence, the punishment, as expressed in Hosea chapter 2, verse 13, I will also cause all her mirth to cease, her feasts, her new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all her appointed seasons. Those are seasons of rejoicing. The new moon is also on the list. Nothing about that in the five books of Moses either, but evidently this became the institution of the new moon in the time of the prophets. Unless we think that inasmuch as Israel was not faithful on the new moons, then that's it for the new moon. It doesn't have any significance anymore. Just consider in Ezekiel chapter 46. This is not the here and now. This is the future. Remember, we already noted. From Ezekiel chapter 40 and on, the prophet is not in the here and now. He's giving us a vivid portrayal of Jerusalem of the future. Rebuilt. And there's a vivid description of the offerings that are brought in the temple of the future. Thus said the Lord God, the gate of the inner court that looks toward east shall be shut the 6 working days, but on the Sabbath day it shall be opened, and in the day of the new moon it shall be opened. Likewise the people of the land shall prostrate themselves at the door of that gate before the Lord in the Sabbaths and in the new moons. And a few verses afterward, we read, in the day of the new moon, there's a special set of offerings that is to be brought. Again, a level of observance of the new moon for which we see no earlier precedent. But truth be told, the real tour de force in this is the end of the book of Isaiah. Now, at the end of the book of Isaiah, we read of the establishment of God's kingdom. This is the whole context in these verses, and the culmination, the last 2 verses. For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to prostrate themselves before me, says the Lord. Now this is fascinating, in particular because, note the order. We have a general principle, a principle in our tradition on manifold planes, that if you have something that is more common and more rare, what takes precedence? The more common. What, after all, is the holiest day in the biblical calendar? You said the Sabbath, right? Right, the Sabbath. I can give you 2 clear lines of evidence. You know, if someone violates Yom Kippur, it carries a very severe penalty. Being cut off in heaven. The second most severe penalty that we read in the Torah. The most severe penalty is capital punishment. If one violates the Sabbath, it carries capital punishment. It's more severe. Perhaps on a more benign plane, we have a practice of reading passages from the Torah. On ordinary weekdays, we read 3. On minor holidays, like Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month, we read 4. Major holidays, we read 5. On Yom Kippur, we read 6. Every Sabbath, we read 7. Sabbath, the holiest day of the year. So, some people might wonder, isn't that making holiness into something routine? And of course the answer is precisely. To establish a holy routine. So, in general then, if something is more common and something is more rare, we give precedence to that which is more common. So typically, for example, in Leviticus chapter 23, when we read about the Sabbath with respect to the appointed times, the special holy days of the year, what comes first? Sabbath. Holy days, second. In Numbers, in chapters 28 and 29 and 30, with special offerings that are brought in the Holy Temple, the sequence is the offerings that are brought on a daily basis, the offerings of the Sabbath, then the offerings of the new moon, then the offerings of the holy days that happen, of course, only once a year each. So that's the order then. First Sabbath, then new moon, then festivals. And what happens at the end of Isaiah? It shall come to pass from one new moon to another and from one Sabbath to the other. That the new moon comes before Sabbath. What does that mean? We'll find out. But what it clearly means is on some plane, the sanctity and specialness of the new moon, despite the fact that it's not as common as the weekly Sabbath, gives it precedence over the Sabbath. That doesn't imply that it's less important, that implies it's more important. And what it means, again, we don't know. But you see that there's a crescendo with respect to the new moon. Boggles the mind. It's not something static. With respect to all the holy days, with respect to the Sabbath as well. What God ordains in the 5 books of Moses is what continues forever. And with respect to the new moon, it's a moving target. It acquires newfound significance over the course of time. So again, what exactly that means, I don't know. But I'm noting it here because it conveys to us a sense of the dynamism that is unfolding in this subject of the new moon. And the reason that it's so important for me to stress this point is because I think it has far, far deeper ramifications than merely the way that we observe the new moon. If you look at the first book of Kings, chapter 7, verse 21, and this is an excellent specimen of scripture that you will note has nothing to do with the new moon, nothing to do with the holy days, nothing to do with anything we've discussed until now, except it does. You got to look carefully. This is in the description of the construction of Solomon's temple. And he set up the pillars at the porch of the temple. And he set up the right pillar and called the name thereof Yachin. And he set up the left pillar and called the name thereof Boaz. But of course, Yachin and Boaz are words in Hebrew. And we have a tradition that Boaz, which we could read as, in it is might, is the pillar that represents, that invokes the sun. Because after all, the sun is the sun. It epitomizes might. It is, after all, the most dramatic, most significant luminary in the sky. And Yachin literally means he will prepare. something that's not there yet, something that's coming but not yet present. That corresponds to the moon. You have these two pillars. One corresponds to the sun, the other corresponds to the moon. And in general, in biblical jargon, you anticipate that, in as much as though not to reflect at all upon lefties, because in the book of Judges we read that Ehud, son of Gerah, is described as Iter Yad Yemino, which literally means that for Ehud ben Gerah, who we would describe as a lefty, this was his right hand. The strong hand is, by definition, the right hand. But to that extent, then, you expect that if you're going to assign right and left to the sun and the moon, so what should be the right? The sun. The moon should be the left. And with respect to these pillars, it's the other way around. The right pillar is named for the moon. The left pillar is named for the sun. And, of course, inevitably, that strikes us as odd. But I think it has dramatic implications that, as we shall see, have a lot to do with the coming of the Messiah. Psalm 89 is about the progenitor of the Messiah, King David. In verse 4, I have made a covenant with my chosen, I have sworn unto David my servant, I have found David my servant, with my holy oil have I anointed him. Once have I sworn by my holiness, surely I will not be false unto David. Now, look at verses 37 and 38. His seed shall endure forever, his throne as the sun before me. But that's not the high note of this crescendo. Verse 38, it shall be established forever as the moon, and be steadfast as the witness in sky, Selah. Now, if you picture this as a crescendo, if anything, you expect that the moon should be a lead up to the sun, since the sun, after all, is the high note of the crescendo. Is it not? No, it is not. That is clearly here. The sun is a lead up to the moon, which strikes us, of course, as odd. In Psalm 19, it is upon the sun that we focus in speaking of how the sun is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber and rejoices as a strong man to run his course. His going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the end of it. There is nothing hid from the heat thereof. The sun plays such a central role in our lives, in our world. Yes? We'll get to that later on. Okay? Let's not jump the gun here. Okay? We're not there yet. Okay. But right now, we're talking simply about the symbolisms of the sun and moon, respectively. I want to call our attention to Psalm 72. It would appear that Psalm 72 is likewise a challenge to the supremacy being granted the moon, because just consider what we read here with respect to the trajectory of the moon. I'm leading up to verse 7, but let's start with verse 5. They shall fear you with the sun, or in the sun's presence, and before the moon throughout all generations. This is a psalm that is addressed to King Solomon. Can we just read this passage? Okay, this is a psalm that's addressed to King Solomon. May he come down like rain upon the mown grass, as showers that water the earth. In his days let the righteous flourish, and abundance of peace, till the moon be no more. Which again seems to call into question the significance of the moon. Yes? If you could just try to project a little bit. Hold your horses. We're not there. You're quoting Isaiah. We're not. No, really, seriously. It's on the agenda. Okay. But maybe if you You mean over here, until the moon be no more? Good question. We're going to have to try to figure out what the moon be no more will mean. But we're going to have to wait patiently for another few minutes until we get there. But there is reason to my madness, at least I hope so, in terms of the ordering of these verses. So, but I appreciate the comment. We definitely are heading to get there. But again, this significance that is accorded specifically to the moon, when we consider Psalm 89 at greater length. Again, Psalm 89, all about David. Verse 21, I have found David my servant, with my holy oil have I anointed him. And what's indeed the theme in Psalm 81 that specifically brings us into a kind of resonance with the moon? When you look up at the sun, doesn't matter when you look up at it, you see the same thing. The sun symbolizes constancy. The sun, from our vantage point, is static. Is that true of the moon? The moon symbolizes dynamism. Every time you look at the moon, you see something different. Every night, a different phase. Every day, different moonrise, different moonset. The moon is constantly in flux. Well, when we consider the message of what's taking place in Psalm 89, so is the house of David. And so by extension are we. That is, on the one hand, from the top of the page here, in verse 27, he shall call unto me, you are my Father, my God, the rock of my salvation. I also will appoint him firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. Forever will I keep for him my kindness, and my covenant shall stand fast with him. His seed also will I make to endure forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. But from verse 31, if his children forsake my Torah and walk not in my ordinance, if they profane my statutes and keep not my commandments, then will I visit their transgressions with the rod and their iniquity with plagues. So there's an ebbing. The moon waxes and wanes. So does the house of David. So do we. And yet, still it all, verse 34, but my kindness will not break off from him, nor will I be false to my faithfulness. My covenant will I not profane, nor alter that which is gone out of my lips. Once have I sworn by my holiness, surely I will not be false unto David. His seed shall endure forever, his throne as the sun before me, but it's much, much more than the sun. It's the moon. It shall be established forever as the moon, and be steadfast as the witness in sky, Selah. The moon, dynamism, the ebb, waning, and yet waxing again, is precisely the message that we internalize with respect to the house of David, and by extension with respect to all of us. And this is something that we have an esoteric tradition to associate with the progenitor of the dynasty of David. Recall in Genesis chapter 38, we read about the birth of Judah's twins. And it came to pass in the time of her travail, referring to Tamar, behold, twins were in her womb, and it came to pass when she travailed that one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, this came out first. And it came to pass as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out, and she said, why have you made a breach for yourself? Therefore his name was called, or he called his name, Peretz. And afterward came out his brother, that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called, or he called his name, Zerach. Peretz and Zerach. Peretz bursting forth, Or alternatively, the same root, paratz, means to break down. Zerach, shining. Of course, on the most obvious plane, Peretz, breaking forth, because he broke forth and was born when his brothers started to come out. And likewise, on the most transparent, superficial plane, Zerach, shining, the scarlet thread, it shines. He has a scarlet thread wrapped around his wrist. But on a deeper level. Who is the progenitor of the house of David? We read it explicitly at the end of the book of Ruth. No, Boaz is the great-grandfather. I'm talking about between Zerach and Peretz. Which of these two? Peretz. Peretz. In the lineage of David that appears at the end of the book of Ruth, David is descended from Peretz. The one whose name means to break down, as opposed to the one whose name means to shine. And there's an esoteric tradition that says Zerach is named Shine because Zerach corresponds to the sun. But the house of David, the Messiah, descend from Peretz, which means to break down, burst forth. Because that's like the moon. Because the moon is always waxing and waning. No 2 days the same. Always in flux. And so is the house of David, and so on some plane are we. With respect to the sun, we read in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, what profit has man of all his labors wherein he labors under the sun? Likewise, that which has been is that which shall be, and that which has been done is that which shall be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. And parenthetically, we'll note, excuse me. Okay, fine, it's off. Okay. So again, with respect to the sun, there's nothing new under the sun. And how do we refer to that unit of time in Hebrew that is based upon the sun, the year? What's the Hebrew word? For the year in Hebrew. Shana. And what's the root of Shana? Because in Hebrew we always look for the biblical root. Shana, from the root of lishanen, to repeat. Because the sun is just constant repetition. And that's precisely this theme of there is nothing new beneath the sun. And, of course, correspondingly, with respect to the sun, there's nothing new. The Hebrew word that we've been constantly seeing with respect to the moon, the Hebrew word for month. What's the Hebrew word for month? Chodesh. And what's the root of Chodesh? Chadash. New. And of course, on the most obvious plane, the new moon. But on a deeper plane, that's precisely what the moon is all about. Constant newness. Ongoing dynamism. There's nothing new beneath the sun, but there's something new that is represented specifically by the moon. And that brings me to an additional dimension that I wanted to share with you. And some of you may recall, because I believe we discussed this last year as well, but it's very germane here. The first two places in the Bible where we encounter Jerusalem. So the first two places that we encounter Jerusalem are in the 5 books of Moses, and we do not encounter the name Jerusalem. But we know it's referring to Jerusalem. The first place is, of course, right in front of us over here. In Genesis chapter 14, Melchizedek, king of Salem. brought forth bread and wine, and he was a priest of God the Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abraham of God the Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." Where is Salem? How do you know? We have to do an exhaustive survey of every place in the Bible that we encounter Salem as a place name. And that would be Psalm 76, verse 3. It's the only other place. In Salem also is set his tabernacle and his dwelling place in Zion. So, of course, you appreciate that in the style of biblical poetry, just as tabernacle corresponds to the dwelling place, Salem corresponds to Zion, same place. That's the whole structure of the couplet in biblical poetry. You say the same thing in similar words. So that's the first place that we encounter Jerusalem in the Bible. And where's the second place that we encounter Jerusalem in the Bible? Also not by that name. Sorry? Zion is also not in the 5 books of Moses, and this second place is also in Genesis. What? I'm sorry? That's way down the road in the book of Samuel and the book of Chronicles. I'm still in Genesis. The next place yes. We refer to, you're referring actually to 28, Genesis 28, which we discussed earlier, but before that. Before that, and explicitly. Because Luz is a matter of interpretation. But the second place that we encounter Jerusalem is very explicit and undeniable. It's in Genesis chapter 22. Let's see how explicit it is. And it came to pass after these things that God did test Abraham and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Take now your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac, and go you unto the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell you of. Where's Jerusalem? How do you know Mount Moriah is Jerusalem? Because we talked about it earlier today. Remember? Remember Chronicles 2, chapter 3, verse 1. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father, for which provision had been made in the place of David in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So, Jerusalem. Unmistakable. Temple Mount, right? Parenthetically, how many places in all the Bible do we encounter Moriah as a designation? We just did. Those are the only two places. Genesis chapter 22, second book of Chronicles chapter 3. But unmistakably, we're talking about Jerusalem. But now there's an additional dimension that I need to share with you. In Genesis chapter 22, there's another name associated with this spot. The name given it in verse 14 by Abraham. And Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will see. In Hebrew, Yireh. As it is said to this day, in the mount where the Lord will be seen. Yera'eh. So this is the name of Jerusalem, Yireh, given it by none other than Abraham. And there's this other name, Salem, Shalem, given it by Melchizedek. There's one other point that we need to address, and that is, who is this Melchizedek? Of course, you could say, that's the man's name. And it could be. He's a priest of God the Most High. But, Melchizedek might not be a name, it might be a title. If we parse out the name in Hebrew, Melchizedek means king over tzedek, over righteousness or justice. It's interesting to note, first of all, that we encounter the name Melchizedek only one other place in the Hebrew Bible, and that is in Psalm 110 in verse 4, the Lord has sworn and will not repent, you are priest forever, after the manner of, or because of the speech of Melchizedek. And since we have no evidence that this would be referring to the same Melchizedek in the time of Abraham, so maybe it's a title, maybe it's not a name. Furthermore, when we consider the first place where we do encounter Jerusalem as a place name, in Joshua chapter 10, the king of Jerusalem is named Adonitzedek, which doesn't sound like Melchizedek, but it actually means almost exactly the same thing. Melchizedek, king over Tzedek, Adonitzedek, lord over Tzedek. So perhaps, just as every king of Egypt is called Pharaoh, every king of Gerar is called Avimelech, perhaps every king of Jerusalem was known as Adonitzedek, Melchizedek. Maybe it's a title. And we have a tradition with respect to the Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14, that indeed it's a title of none other than Shem, the righteous son of Noah. That it is Shem who calls the place Shalem, Salem. If you do the arithmetic, yes, he was still alive at this time, unequivocally. Which brings us to an ancient tradition that we have, and I know I shared this with you last year, but it certainly is germane now for a different reason, with respect to the name of Jerusalem. Again, Melchizedek, the righteous Shem, son of Noah, names the city Shalem, Salem. Abraham names the city Yireh. And God has a problem. If I name the city Shalem, Salem, as the righteous Shem named it, I'm offending the righteous Abraham. If I name the city Yireh as the righteous Abraham named it, I'm offending the righteous Shem. So, what's the solution? I name the city as they both named it. Yireh, Shalem, Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. Now, there are a number of lessons that it's important for us to glean from this tradition. Number one, of course, we consider that Shem, righteous son of Noah, represents all the descendants of Noah. All the descendants of Noah means all of humanity. Abraham, the first patriarch of Israel, represents Israel. For whom is Jerusalem the destination? For everyone. That is, just to see it inside, in Psalm 122, we saw this earlier, Jerusalem is built as a city that is joined together within itself, whither the tribes went up, even the tribes of the Lord, as a testimony unto Israel to give thanks unto the name of the Lord. It's the destination for Israel. But, again, Isaiah chapter 2. It'll come to pass in the end of days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established at the top of mountains and exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to us. Many peoples will go and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. It's everyone's destination. Yes. If you could just try to project a little bit better.
You brought up that David, his descendant, via Tamar. Is it applicable that she is the descendant of Shem? She's the daughter of the high priest?
There is that tradition. It's not written anywhere explicitly in the Bible, but we have a midrashic tradition like that. I certainly could. That is, like, ultimately, we definitely appreciate that even more so. Who's King David's great-grandmother? Ruth the Moabite. So unequivocally, there definitely is that dimension on a global level that the Redeemer is the Redeemer of the entire world, definitely. But what I want to stress here, of course, besides the obvious first-order lesson, which is that Jerusalem is everyone's destination, Israel and the nations, if we delve more deeply into these two names, Yireh and Shalem, consider the connotations of the two. And consider how they need to coexist in a kind of constant tension. Yir'eh, God will see, expressed in future tense. Something that is going to be manifest that is not yet manifest. Shalem, what does shalem mean in Hebrew? Complete. Complete within itself. So, is Jerusalem what's going to be, or what is complete within itself? Answer, yes. Yes. That both dimensions necessarily are part and parcel of the identity of Jerusalem. And it's in the same vein that we can well appreciate this interplay between sun and moon, not merely on an astronomical plane, but on the level of how world history unfolds. We have an idea in our tradition that the nations of the world reckon time by the sun, which obviously is manifest in the Gregorian calendar, and that Israel reckons time by the moon, even though, of course, it's both. And there isn't one right way or wrong way, and ultimately the biblical calendar is a reconciliation between these two. Again, luni-solar, because both the sun and the moon are going to be relevant in the reckoning of time, the reckoning of seasons, the reckoning of the sequence of the holidays. And likewise, with respect to the trajectory that leads to the redemption of the world, there is that aspect that is represented by that left pillar, Boaz. In it is might, the dimension that comes from the sun. And simultaneously at the same time, Yachin. Yachin, like Yir'eh, expressed in the future tense. We see something, but what we see is not yet at fruition. What we see anticipates a level of completeness that is not yet manifest. It still demands coming to its fullest fruition. And indeed, it's on that plane, recalling in Psalm 72, until the moon is no more, on the one hand, Isaiah chapter 24. Then the moon will be confounded and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his elders shall be glory. But there's an additional dimension. The additional dimension, and this is already noted before, in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 26, the light of the moon will be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will be sevenfold, as the light of the 7 days. In our tradition, the 7 days of creation. In the day that the Lord binds up the bruise of his people and heals the stroke of their wound. Everything we see is leading to a level of completeness that is not yet there. Yes? We mentioned earlier Psalm 72. Until the moon is no more. And again, on some plane, on the one hand, the moon is confounded, the sun ashamed, because the light is coming from God. But by consequence of that, there is this dynamism. The light of the moon becomes as the light of the sun of the sun becomes as sevenfold. When everything comes to its place. When the Lord binds up the bruise of his people and heals the stroke of their wound. And ultimately, when we consider what the message is about the light, and this really is more than anything else, the culmination of the entire process of bringing God's light into the world. Isaiah chapter 60, arise, shine, for your light is come, and the glory of the Lord is shone upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the peoples. But upon you the Lord will shine, and his glory will be seen upon you. and nations will walk at your light, and kings at the brightness of your shining. The sun shall be no more your light by day, neither for brightness shall the moon give light unto you, because you're past that. The Lord shall be unto you an everlasting light, and your God, your glory. Your sun shall no more go down, neither shall your moon withdraw itself. For the Lord shall be your everlasting light, and the days of your mourning shall be ended. Your people also shall be all righteous. They shall possess the land forever, the branch of your plantings, the work of my plantings, the work of my hands, wherein I glorify. The smallest shall become 1,000, the least a mighty nation. I, the Lord, will hasten it in its time. Hasten. Dynamism. Reaching a level of completeness that we can scarcely even imagine. So in this interplay of the sun, constancy, nothing new under the sun, and the moon, constant dynamism, there's a crucial message for us, for the world, a message of hope. Maybe it's expressed in the fact that Rosh Chodesh is in this crescendo of gathering momentum and becoming more and more significant. And maybe altogether it's the hope of all of the world. The realization that we're moving. We're moving. What the moon signifies is we're constantly moving. And that moving is a moving toward the establishment of God's kingdom. May we speedily see it established forevermore. Any comments, please? Indeed, right? Sure, of course. You'll note that we have an idea in our tradition that Jerusalem is the light of the world. And who is the light of Jerusalem? God. Yes? I don't know if I would see it as I would intuit that it is considering the implicit plural suffix, shalayim. I wouldn't see it in any rigorous sense as implying double peace, but maybe what whoever made that proposition was intimating is what we just discussed. In other words, that there is this aspect of a constant ongoing dynamism of yireh, of God will see. And on that plane, a gathering of momentum that is not yet fulfilled. And on the other hand, shalem, which of course comes from the root of shalom, completeness. True peace is completeness. That level is likewise going to be embodied by the name of Jerusalem. Yes?
You're talking about the moon always changing, but it always is a new moon.
So that's the dynamism of this world. But if we ask until what point, ultimately, again, we have this idea that is incorporated in Isaiah chapter 30 of the moon going beyond that. That is, the light of the moon will be as the light of the sun. The light of the sun doesn't cease. So on the one hand, as long as we focus our gaze on this world, you're right, the moon is constantly waxing and waning. And the most important take home from that is you got to keep on the move. You're not finished yet. But there is this vision of a future when we graduate beyond that. And that's, of course, the establishment of God's kingdom. Yes? The tides. Sure, and of course, The tides result predominantly from the moon. Right. Absolutely. Yes. If you could try to project a little. I don't hear so well. Yes. Well, it certainly does end with the word Yerushalayim. That's the final word, and very much the culmination of the hopes of Israel over the course of the 2 millennia of exile to return to Zion and Jerusalem. Right. Okay, that's the only way I ever sing it. Anyone else? Yes.
Liked your analogy about how the sun remains constant and the moon is somewhat, perhaps some of us might get a little encouragement to realize that our own spiritual lives are somewhat like the waxing and waning, realizing that the Lord is constantly watching over it and bringing us to the place He wants to be in us.
Absolutely, and that wherever we wander, we can always come home. Right. And maybe in this vein, just to consider, this is always something that to me is, in this regard, really a foundational take-home message. In Zechariah chapter 3, verse 7, we read the blessing that God bids the prophet Zechariah deliver to his contemporary Joshua the high priest. And while undoubtedly your translations will render that blessing differently, I'm going to translate rigorously from the Hebrew. The blessing is, I will give you walkers among these standing ones. Now, your translation probably doesn't talk about walkers and standing ones because, well, you might be wondering yourselves, what does it mean? I will give you walkers among these standing ones? What is it saying? Man is the walker. Man is always the walker. Man is constantly in flux. The angels are the standing ones. As we read in Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 7 and 9, their legs are straight. They don't turn as they move. The angels are static. The angels are created as spiritual beings, completely actualized, and so they remain. On the opposite extreme is the beast. The beast is created as a completely physical being, and so it remains. As one of the commentators notes, the Hebrew word for beast, livestock, behemah, can be seen as a composite of ba, ma. What it is already contained within it. As opposed to man. Man named Adam for Adamah, the earth. What does the earth symbolize? What does the earth represent, especially in an agrarian society? The mechanism for actualizing potential. You take a little seed, you place it in the earth, and there a mighty tree grows. The earth was the means for actualizing the potential that was found in the seed, but that was only latent. And that's what man is all about, actualizing potential. Man is the walker. The blessing is, I will give you walkers among these standing ones. The angels are the standing ones. I will give you walkers. You'll be moving. You'll be moving in the realm of these static angels because you're not static. And by consequence, the righteous are greater than the ministering angels. They can have a closer relationship with God than even the angels. Because when you harness that dynamism to come to God, there's nothing greater. There's nothing more sacred. The greatest blessing. Yes? Yes?
Jeremiah 31, the calling back to Israel of all this
Jeremiah chapter 31 is exquisitely relevant here on manifold planes. Perhaps the most obvious being when we consider what we read in Jeremiah chapter 31 about Ephraim. That is, in the words of the prophet, Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 17, I indeed heard Ephraim wandering. You have chastised me, and I was chastised as a calf, untrained. Bring me back that I may return, because you are God, my Lord. Because after I returned, I felt remorse. And after I confessed and knew, I smote the thigh. I was confounded and embarrassed by the shame of my youth. And God, as it were, responds to Ephraim's moan. Is it that Ephraim is my precious one, a dandled child, that the more I speak of him, the more I remember him? Therefore my innards churn over him. I will surely have compassion for him, says the Lord. The constant promise of being able to return home. And of course, I always feel compelled to add here, returning home. What does the word teshuvah mean in Hebrew? So it's usually translated as repentance, which is certainly a legitimate translation, but as a great scholar in the last generation notes, you can get a rigorous definition of what teshuvah means in the first book of Samuel, chapter 7. The last 3 verses describe the prophet Samuel as what we would call a circuit judge, going from one place to another and judging Israel in all these places. And we read the circuit in verses 15 and 16, and the last verse of the chapter, verse 17, tells us, U'tshuvato haramata kisham beito. His teshuvah, his return, was to Ramah, because that's where his home was. Teshuvah means returning home. You know that when you return home, you're returning home to God, because God is always there waiting for you, arms outstretched. And this is also part of the moon. Dynamism. Wherever you are, however far you may have wandered, you always have the opportunity to return home to our Father.
Okay, we're going to take another break for 15 minutes, and then we'll have the last session. We have some new food out there as well, different from last time, and more coffee and hot water. So go for it, and we'll be right back for the last session in 15 minutes.
Yeah,
But wait, there's more. Wait 1 second. Hold this. I'm going to have you say something, but I got to go grab it. We have a few more of these left from last year.
Okay.
Just tell them a little bit and instead of 18, they're only $8. So.
Okay, so these are the Bible studies that we gave last year, and what they contain within them is a whole lot of supplemental studies about Jerusalem. About Jerusalem.
All highlighted, colored Bible verses like he's doing now. They're regularly 18, they're only $8, and there's only a few left on the table.
Okay.
But wait, you want to tell them what it was about?
These are all intended as supplemental Bible studies when you folks come to the Holy City, all about Jerusalem. That is all about prophecies more current than today's newspapers and what we see as God's works in the Holy Land today. So it's mostly verses from the Bible. There's also some interesting stuff with respect to the last few centuries of history in Jerusalem. And I think it's a tremendous inspiration personally.
Hey, only a few left. Okay, here we go. This is going to be the very last session for today. And if you listen up, tomorrow morning, we're going to start at 10. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And again, we'll probably have 2 sessions, and then we'll have a break for lunch, and then we'll come back and have some more sessions. But for those who were looking for a place to put the money for the books, there's a little brown wooden tithe box over there. You can just put the money in there. So, have you enjoyed everything so far? Woo-hoo! Guess what? Now we're going to unmask the book of Esther and the story of Purim. Esther. Yay! All right. And Haman. All right. And Chaim Eisen. Hey!
Well, I'm glad you didn't put me together with Haman. Okay. Okay, so in as much as we just passed what would have otherwise been the days of celebration of Purim. So Pastor Mark suggested that we talk a little about Purim. And there's so much to talk about Purim. And I'd like to expand upon the theme of Purim on a number of additional levels, God willing, tomorrow, because I realize our time is somewhat limited today. But we have to at least get our toes wet. Unmasking the book of Esther and Purim. You know, when I named this session Unmasking, what I think you can very well appreciate, I remember Pastor Mark showing me, sending me a picture of him in masquerade from Purim a few years ago, the masks. The idea of masquerading on Purim. So if you ask me what the provenance of this practice is, it certainly is nowhere stated anywhere in the Bible, certainly not explicitly. To give you the provenance, where it's first mentioned, it is first mentioned by the medieval Rabbi Judah, son of Eliezer, the Levite of Minsk, who was born in Minsk in 1408. He was exiled from there in 1462 together with the rest of the Jewish community, and he died in Padua in 1508. You'd think that with such a long lifespan, he would have left behind a great literary legacy, and undoubtedly he would have, except that all of his writings were burnt, and only 16 responsa, that is, responses to inquiries about Jewish practice, survived. And in the 15th, he refers to the masks that people are accustomed to wearing on Purim. Masks. Why masks? So, of course, the text that tells us about Purim is the book of Esther, and we need to ask ourselves, so in the book of Esther, who is masquerading? There are a number of answers to this question. That's the last answer. So hold your horses. But who's masquerading? I know I spilled all my beans at the outset. So the first answer to the question, who is masquerading, is what? So, Esther. That is, Esther chapter 2. Esther had not told of her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not tell it. And further on in chapter 2, after she's already been made queen, Esther had not told her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. So Esther is masquerading. Esther is masquerading, in some sense, as a non-Jew. And ironically, in chapter 8, we read about the folks who are masquerading as Jews. In verse 17, and many from among the peoples of the land profess themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews was fallen upon them, so they're masquerading as if they are Jews. And besides these two masqueraders, when you consider what's taking place in chapter 6, where Haman thinks the king is asking him how He should be honored. So basically, what does he say? Dress me up as the king. Pretend I'm king. Masquerade me as king. And of course, it is his undoing to learn that he is expected to do precisely that to his arch enemy, Mordechai. The king says to him, make haste and take the apparel and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordechai the Jew. And Haman took the apparel and the horse and dressed Mordechai. Okay. So we got a lot of levels of masquerading here. Beyond that, what else is in masquerade? And this is on a more somber note. The land of Israel is masked. That is, Jerusalem appears in the book of Esther only once, which is in chapter 2, verse 6, referring to Mordechai, who had been exiled from Jerusalem, with the exile that had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. Do you get a sense of a kind of repetitive theme in that verse? Exile, exile, exile. 4 times. Some conjugation of being exiled appears in that verse. The land of Israel, Jerusalem, is masked, is in exile. And, of course, inevitably, we appreciate that when Jerusalem is in exile, then on some plane, God, too, is concealed. As we read in Jeremiah chapter 12, I have forsaken my house, I have cast off my heritage. And it is in that vein that we appreciate the message in Deuteronomy chapter 31, when Israel is not faithful. Then my anger will be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them, and I will hide my face from them, and they shall be devoured. And in verse 18, likewise, I will surely hide my face in that day for all the evil which they shall have wrought. And of course, what is so poignant, really in the Hebrew, it's glaring, is the conjugation of hiding. In verse 18, Anochi haster, astir, self-same letters as the name Esther. So on some plane, Esther personifies concealment. And building on this theme, the utmost masquerade, God in concealment. How many times has God's name appeared in the whole book of Esther? 0. The closest we get to God's name appearing, you could say, is Esther chapter 5, verse 4. This isn't very close at all. And Esther said, if it seems good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I prepared for him. Where's God's name? Look in Hebrew. See this? Let the king and Haman come this day. In Hebrew, Yavo, beginning with a Yud. Hamelech, beginning with a Hey. Vehaman, beginning with a Vav. Hayom, beginning with another Hey. The Yud followed by Hey, followed by Vav, followed by Hey. That's God's holy name. And this is where it appears? Let the king and Haman come this day to a wine feast? If that's not concealment, I don't know what is. It's all about concealment. And indeed, the only places that you get anything close to God's name appearing, we'll discuss these 4 verses, God willing, tomorrow, is through either opening initials or closing initials of contiguous words. You can see in chapter 7, the Yud followed by the Hey, followed by the Vav, followed by the Hey. In chapter 1, it's Yud preceded by Hey, preceded by Vav, preceded by Hey, as opening initials. And here, closing initials. This isn't merely a word game. We'll actually talk about what these verses signify, but it's definitely masquerading. Definitely concealment. And yet, we have this extraordinary tradition on what we read at the end of chapter 9 of the book of Esther, that the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so it shall not be revoked, that they would keep these 2 days according to the writing thereof and according to the appointed time thereof every year. And these days will be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city, that these days of Purim will not be revoked from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them cease from their seed. Purim is forever. More forever than any other holidays. No other holiday has a statement like that attached to it. What in the world is going on here? What does it mean? So I'm going to make a proposition, and you'll see how this plays out in what I'd like to share from this text of Esther. So here's the proposition. I remember almost half a century ago, goodness, that makes it sound awfully old. I guess the shoe fits. Okay, so I was a student, I'll say this much to my shame and embarrassment, at Columbia University, but it was a different place in those days, so I'm not responsible. And one of the courses that all students were required to take was music humanities. So of course there were a lot of sections of the course, and I still vividly remember my professor for music humanities, a very kindly old gentleman, Professor Christopher Hatch, who conducted the course as a history, a kind of intellectual history of the development of Western music. Of course, every stage in the development of Western music accompanied by musical selections. And I still vividly remember the way the course began. The first session, he played a recording of a group of Yemenite Jews chanting one of the Psalms. And he explained, all of Western music derives from the music in the church, going back to the Gregorian chants. But the music in the church, the Gregorian chants, goes back to the music in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Now, I have to admit, I still don't have such a clear answer to how he got from the music in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem to this group of Yemenite Jews chanting one of the Psalms, but I'm sure he had his reasons. But in any case, that idea that Western music derives from the music in the Holy Temple, I want to extend one step further. You know, Jews never read the Bible, certainly not in public. We sing it. Seriously, if you look in the Hebrew Bible, you will see that besides the letters, which are the consonants, and the subscripted and superscripted dots, which are the vowels, there are little signs, mostly squiggles, associated with every single word in the Hebrew Bible that give you instructions for how to sing it. It's basically an extraordinarily complex system of punctuation. Now, why am I mentioning this right now? Because I have my pet theory, inspired by Professor Christopher Hatch, that the inspiration for opera comes from the book of Esther. Because, again, we never read it, we sing it. We sing it on the holiday of Purim. And what is it, if not a drama unfolding through song? Well, that sounds like opera to me, doesn't it? And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because, as in every drama, there's a kind of telescoping of events. You know, drama can unfold over the course of many years, but the actual playing of the drama is very brief. And I ask you, over what period of time do the events of the book of Esther unfold? Let's take a look. In Esther chapter 1, verse 3, in the third year of Ahasuerus' reign, That's when he has his banquet and ditches Vashti. In chapter 2, Esther is brought unto King Ahasuerus in the 10th month, in the 7th year of his reign. In other words, 4 years later. And in chapter 3, when Haman casts lots to annihilate the Jews, he's doing so in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus. In other words, 9 years after the story begins, and the day that comes out is the end of this 12th year. In other words, the events of the book of Esther unfold over the course of approximately a decade. You wouldn't have thought it, would you? And the reason I'm emphasizing this point is because, inevitably you appreciate that when everything gets telescoped into a relatively short narrative, so you see connections that at the time may not have been at all obvious. And there's an undergirding for this entire outlook that we should consider. And I think it is perhaps best intimated in this passage from Deuteronomy chapter 31, and that is, there is meaning, significance to history. That is, to explain what I mean by that. If you consider Eastern religions and ideologies, basically you see a cyclic view of history. And in all Western religions and ideologies, there's a notion of history moving linearly, or maybe spiraling forward, but definitely moving forward. And if we ask, what underlies that difference? My proposition is very simple. All Eastern religions and ideologies developed not under the influence of the Bible. All Western religions and ideologies were molded through the impact that the Bible had on civilization. And this is one of the most important core messages in the Bible. That history is something significant. I think it is perhaps best exemplified, certainly not only, but most vividly in Moses' song in Deuteronomy chapter 32, which is the song to which God refers in chapter 31 here. That this song will be a witness for me against the children of Israel. What is Moses' song about? It's about the significance of history. It's about a process unfolding over the course of human history. And that in itself vests us with a sense of responsibility. Because not only is history not just going around in circles, but God is giving us a summons to take responsibility, to be the means through which the world advances toward its divinely ordained goal. And so it is in this vein that we plunge into the book of Esther, in which nothing is made obvious, because everything is only there if you dig for it. Remember, it's all masked. And to me, the most important key verse in the book of Esther is what Mordecai says to Esther in chapter 4, verse 14. If you altogether hold your peace in this time, then will relief and deliverance come to the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will be lost. And who knows whether you are not come to royal estate for such a time as this? Question mark. Who knows? And of course, it's the book of Esther. No obvious answers. Mordecai doesn't say, God knows, because that would make it too obvious. Who knows? Figure it out. This is left as an exercise. But this idea that if you hold your peace, then the relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place. Who told him? How does he know? He knows. He knows because God promises that require of him, so to speak, the guarantee that Israel is not going to be destroyed. Relief and deliverance will come. They'll come from another place, and the result of it coming from another place, you might think, if they're going to come from another place anyway, why not have to do anything? Says Mordechai, the Jews will be saved regardless. If you don't do what you need to be doing, you'll be lost. And when we consider what that means, what's the message here? Consider a number of verses. In the song of Hannah, mother of the prophet Samuel, in Samuel 1, chapter 2, verse 3, multiply not exceeding proud talk, let not arrogance come out of your mouth, for the Lord is the Lord of knowledge. And by him actions are weighed, and God weighs everything. All actions, everyone's decisions. But now, that doesn't mean that God straitjackets us in making our choices. On the contrary, Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 19, great in counsel, mighty in work, whose eyes are open upon all the ways of the sons of men, to give everyone according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. Great in counsel, mighty in work. That's God. But God, in being great in counsel, mighty in work, gives everyone his or her just deserts. So if we ask the question, this is really the bombshell question that we always need to contemplate. What is the source of evil in the world? There can only be one answer to this question, and it's explicit in the Bible. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I am the Lord that does all these things. If we wouldn't be saying this, we'd be dualists. There can only be one source for everything. Everything comes from God. And this theme, that God is the source, we see also enunciated in Amos chapter 3. Shall the horn be blown in a city and the people not tremble? Shall evil befall a city and the Lord has not done it? Lamentations chapter 3. Out of the mouth of the Most High proceed not evil and good. Everything comes from God. And yet, what does that mean? And I need to pause here just to get our bearings. When God says, I form light and create darkness, I make peace and create evil. So before we get to the second part of the verse, how do you create darkness? What is darkness? The absence of light. So how do you create an absence? You can create a presence. How do you create an absence? So you create a presence and the potential for that presence to be withdrawn. That's tantamount to creating an absence. I'll add an additional dimension. This is a dimension that is enunciated by one of the great sages of the medieval period, Rabbi Moses Maimonides. The Hebrew word create, boreh, carries a connotation of creation ex nihilo, creating from absolute nothingness. So in Genesis, it is indeed used to describe God's creating from absolute nothing. Says Rabbi Moses Maimonides. So in Genesis chapter 1, this verb means to create from nothing. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, it means to create a nothing. Because again, darkness isn't a presence, it's an absence. And God is described as forming light, but creating, using the same word, boreh, creating darkness, creating the potential for the absence, creating the nothingness. And it's in the same vein that we understand the second half of the verse. I make peace and create evil. Create also. The evil is an absence rather than a presence. God is creating the potential for evil, the potential for the good to be withdrawn. Let's put this in very concrete terms. Where's the first place in all the Bible where we encounter the word evil? Thank you. Exactly. The tree of knowing good and evil. But God's creating the tree of knowing good and evil does not make evil actual. It makes evil into a potential. What makes that potential actual? And the act, of course, is Adam and Eve eating of the tree. There's a difference in the potential and the actual. Man actualizes the potential for evil. The source of the potential is in God. The actualization of that potential, that is consequence of human choice. And that's critical. That is, we appreciate that through our choices, we choose what role we're going to have in the divine drama unfolding in the world. So to put this further into concrete terms, we read in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8, a commandment. This is an imperative. This is something we need to do. When you build a new house, then you shall make a parapet, a railing for the roof, that you not bring a liability of blood upon your house. Now, again, I'm going to translate literally from the Hebrew. Lest the faller fall from it. Now, I doubt your Bibles are going to say, lest the faller fall from it, because it sounds like atrocious English. And it doesn't just sound like atrocious English, it sounds just bizarre. He didn't fall yet. So why are you calling him a faller? Furthermore, if you're going to tell me he's the faller because God already ordained that he should fall, then why make a railing? Let him fall. And this is, I know it sounds humorous, but it's really a serious question. Right? That is, who's calling the shots here? Oh, exactly. We have free will, and here's the rub. We have free will, but there's also the great cosmic divine playwright who has written this drama. God is not only the master playwright, God is also the casting director. And everyone is bidden to choose what role he is going to play in this cosmic drama. And it's all up to us. That is, on the one hand, when we consider the implications of him being a faller, so that's God's plan. That is, as we read it in Isaiah chapter 41, who has wrought and done it? He that called the generations from the beginning. I, the Lord, who am the first, and with the last am the same. Everything ultimately comes from God. But simultaneously, the summons with respect to each of us is choosing what role we are going to play in this cosmic drama unfolding. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 10. And again, this is probably not going to be what your translation says, but I'm translating literally from the Hebrew. Great is he who performs all. Well, you know who that is, right? And God, in performing all, he hires the fool and he hires transgressors. So again, God is the master playwright and casting director, and everyone is going to have a role in this drama, including the fool and including the transgressors. Everyone has a choice to make. Am I going to align myself with God's plan and ally myself with God, and thus, by so doing, take upon myself a role that will advance God's plan to its utmost fruition? Or is a person going to choose exactly the opposite? To do his utmost to thwart God's plan, to oppose God, and by so doing, advance God's plan to its utmost fruition. Either way, he's going to advance God's plan to its utmost fruition. Whether he chooses to align himself with the plan and ally himself with God, or he chooses to oppose God's plan and do his utmost to thwart God, he will advance God's plan. You know why? Because God put him in the world. He is a significant actor. He will have impact. Each and every one of us has impact on the world. Is that clear? Every single person. If you are here for a reason. God put you here. But now, God gives you free will. So, what role am I going to play? One way or the other, I'm going to be advancing God's plan. But the big difference between whether I choose to ally myself with God, to align myself with His plan, or the opposite is not whether the plan is going to go forward, the plan has to go forward. And I'm going to contribute to going forward because I am a significant being because God put me in this world, like each and every one of us. But am I going to succeed in destroying myself? Because if I align myself with God's plan, do my utmost to advance it, I will advance the plan and I will also make myself into a vessel of godliness. And I'll also save myself. And if I choose the opposite, I'll be advancing the plan, I'll succeed in destroying myself. That I will succeed at doing. If a person chooses to oppose God's plan, he will advance God's plan. He will succeed in destroying himself. So, again, God performs all, and he hires everyone, including the fool, including the transgressors. And small wonder in that vein, remember this verse? Esther chapter 5, verse 4, and the initials, the Yud followed by the Hey, followed by the Vav, followed by the Hey, God's holy name, let the king and Haman come this day. Well, God is going to be manifest through a drunken king and his evil viceroy coming to a wine feast. That's also going to be a means through which God's plan is going to unfold, through which God's plan is going to be move forward. And remember, that's exactly the theme that we saw already in Deuteronomy chapter 31. I will surely hide my face in that day. I will hide my face, but I'm still there, just hidden behind the scenes. God's plan is on the move. That's not going to be negated. That's still going to continue to advance. And that brings me to an interesting and tantalizing observation that is especially obvious in the Hebrew. I think you can get something of a sense of it also in the English. When you read Esther chapter 3 about then the king's scribes were called, and it was written, according to all that Haman commanded, the king's satraps and the governors and the provinces, this, that, and the other thing, the whole story about the manner in which the decree is promulgated. And you read in Esther chapter 8, then were the king's scribes called at that time, and there was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, the satraps, the governors, the princes of the provinces, and so on and so forth. The format of these two passages in chapter 3 and chapter 8 is identical. Of course, except that in chapter 3, it is Haman's promulgating the decree to extirpate Israel, and in chapter 8, it is Mordecai promulgating the decree that the Jews can stand in their own defense and be saved. But why use exactly the same format to describe both of these events? Because at the end of the day, it's important for us to bear in mind, it isn't about Mordecai and it isn't about Haman. Mordecai and Haman are both stand-ins. God is masquerading here. He's the one who's behind the scenes. And both Haman and Mordecai, respectively, are in that cast of characters. That cast of characters to bring to the utmost fulfillment God's plan. So it's all about choices and where we go with those choices. And I just want to dwell a little bit on what the operative consequences of this are with respect to the mission. And this really is a mission for each and every one of us. Strip off the masks. most of all, to recognize that the whole world is a mask on God, strip off the mask on God to see God's hand in everything that's taking place. So to put this in very concrete terms, when Haman comes to Ahasuerus in Esther chapter 3, he issues an indictment. An indictment. There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. They're scattered, they're dispersed. Who needs them? Esther, cognizant of this indictment, bids Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan. We need to be united. And it is precisely in that vein of being united, of coming together, that the transformation needs to take place. And of course, it is precisely by reason of that cognizance of coming together that everything gets turned around. And as we need to realize the hiddenness, it's coming as a result of our being disunited, being separated, is because we're paying attention to masks rather than to the essence. And I always cite in this regard, this is one of the verses that I like to cite more than any other. Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9, for then I will turn to the peoples a pure language, that they may call in the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent, shoulder to shoulder. Pastor Mark likes to say, and I agree with him, that the Hebrew doesn't say shoulder to shoulder. The Hebrew says shechem echad, with one shoulder, to become like conjoined twins. And this summons is coming together and recognizing that there may be all sorts of exterior stuff that separates us. And when we strip off the masks, we realize we need to stand together. This is such an imperative today. And it's part of our job in stripping off the masks. And perhaps even more so, in recognizing that the utmost one who is masked here is God. We need to recognize God's presence that otherwise goes so underappreciated in our lives. There's the story of an elderly rabbi who was engrossed in his study, and all of a sudden he hears his young grandson wailing. So, what's the matter? Why are you crying? He says, I was playing hide and seek with my buddies, and when it was my time to hide, no one came seeking me. And then the rabbi starts weeping himself, and he says, isn't that the same thing with God? God says, I availed myself to be sought to them that asked not for me. I availed myself to be found to them that sought me not. I said, behold, here I am, unto a nation that called itself not by my name. I spread out my hands all the day, and no one was looking. To recognize that that mission of stripping away the masks means, above all else, for us to be seeking out God. And, of course, it is precisely in that vein that we need to appreciate maybe the most important take-home of the story of the book of Esther is, if we do so, if we make ourselves cognizant that God is asking us to seek him out, then everything can turn over in an instant. That's exactly what we read, after all, at the beginning of chapter 9. In the 12th month, the month of Adar, the 13th day of the same, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have rule over them, whereas it was turned to the contrary. Everything was reversed. The Jews had rule over those that hated them. Everything can change in an instant. Now, granted, the instant isn't necessarily exactly an instant. As we read in Psalm 90, 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, and as a watch in the night. And I always like to tell the story of the poor man who turns to God and says, Master of the universe, I realize that for you 1,000 years are just as the yesterday when it is past, and all the riches of the world are just like a penny. So, Master of the universe, can you please spare me a penny? And all of a sudden he hears a voice booming from the heavens. Sure, just wait until tomorrow. But still, there's a message here for our lives. And this is something that I see as one of the most poignant passages in the book of Esther. And I think it has direct impact on our lives right now. Consider what happens in chapter 7. The king asks, who is this and where is he that presumes in his heart to do so, to destroy your people? And Esther said, an adversary and an enemy, even this wicked Haman. He's right there. And what's the next thing that happens? It's terrifying. The next thing that happens is the king disappears. The next verse. The king arose in his fury from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. And there's Esther with evil incarnate whom she has just unmasked. Can you imagine? But first of all, what are they supposed to talk about? The weather? But can you imagine the feeling of terror? She's alone with evil incarnate. Now, of course, it only lasts for a moment because the very next verse is, then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the couch whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he even force the queen before me in the house? As the word went forth out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face, and that was the end of Haman. But you know, when when you're living through that moment that seems like an eternity, to know that it only lasts for a moment is scant consolation. And we don't know in our own lives how long that moment lasts, because 1,000 years in your eyes are as the yesterday that is past and the watch of the night. So, sure, there is the quick end of Haman afterward, but then we realize that life is full of these dark moments when we expect to see the redemption, and if anything, what we see immediately is just the opposite. Take another example to illustrate this point. Exodus chapter 5, Moses comes to Pharaoh, and initially at least, what does he accomplish? It gets worse, right? It's not just that he doesn't accomplish anything positive, he accomplishes something negative. That Pharaoh commands the taskmasters, you shall no more give the people straw to make brick as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, and the tally of the bricks which they did make heretofore you shall lay upon them. You shall not diminish aught thereof. Let heavier work be laid upon the men, that they may labor therein, and let them not regard lying words. And the people were scattered abroad throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. What gratuitous extra suffering, as if they weren't suffering enough. So we appreciate very well that when Moses and Aaron encounter the people who had been appointed from among the Hebrews, who were being beaten because the tally of bricks wasn't being delivered, they said unto them, the Lord look upon you and judge, because you have made our Savior to be abhorred in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to slay us. And Moses himself is completely shaken. Lord, wherefore have you dealt ill with these people? Why do you send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has dealt ill with his people, and you haven't saved them. And God's enigmatic response. Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For by a strong hand he shall let them go, and by a strong hand he shall drive them out of his land. So what's taking place here? We have a tradition that when God sent Moses to Pharaoh, it was time to roll out the 10 plagues. Except God, so to speak, had a problem. The moment the plagues will begin, the rank and file Egyptians will say, it's not fair. Pharaoh sinned, why should we be suffering? And that potential complaint against the divine justice was enough to stop the plagues in their tracks. But now, doesn't it seem bizarre that we read in chapter 5, verse 12, the people were scattered abroad throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw? I mean, after all, stubble is everywhere. After the harvest, the fields are filled with stubble. No one wants it, no one needs it. It's basically odorless garbage. So why did they have to scatter themselves over the entire land of Egypt? So, the answer in our tradition is because when the Israelites would go into the fields of the Egyptians to gather the stubble, the Egyptians would come after them with sticks and say, you're not taking stubble from my field. It was just such gratuitous meanness. They didn't even need the stubble. But as a result, it was such misery for the Israelites that they had to scatter over the entire land of Egypt in order to find stubble for straw. And even Moses is shaken by this extra, completely unnecessary suffering. At least that's the way human eyes see it. And what's taking place here? Remember what was holding out the plagues? That the rank and file Egyptians would say, we're innocent, why should we be suffering? Not anymore. Now you're all guilty. Now the plagues will unfold in all of their awesome fury. And all it took was, there was this stick in the spokes that the Egyptians could claim that they were innocent. Now they're not innocent anymore. So, to flesh and blood eyes, it was just some extra ounce of unnecessary suffering. But God sees the heart. For God, that was precisely the means to ready the world for the plagues and to ready the world for the redemption. And of course, this isn't something that just happens once, because as we read in Micah chapter 7, as in the days of your going forth out of the land of Egypt, will I show unto him marvelous things. This is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process, and it's something that we need to appreciate in our time as well. As we see in Jeremiah chapter 16, therefore, behold, the days come, says the Lord, that it shall no more be said, as the Lord lives, that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all the lands whither he had driven them, for I will bring them back into the land that I gave unto their forefathers. And what, more than anything else, is this essentially telling you? Of course, but I'm saying in light of the message of the book of Esther, in the gathering from Egypt. So again, on the one hand, this is the template there also, that you see things only externally, God knows what he's doing. But of course, there's the additional plane, and that is, well, in Egypt, there really were the really dramatic sound and light shows, the plagues, everything else. In the story of the book of Esther, there's none of that. And that's precisely why the book of Esther has a message for all generations. Because, if what we learn from the Exodus from Egypt is the mighty hand and outstretched arm, then in the future we may see miracles that are so vastly greater that the miracles of Egypt pale to insignificance. But Purim, which doesn't have a single explicit miracle in it, has a lesson to us for all generations. To declare your loving kindness in the morning and your faithfulness in the night. There are times like the night when everything is dark and nothing is clear. On so many levels, we live in a period of night today. And it's at times like that when it's hard for us to declare the loving kindness because we don't experience it. And we need to be sustained by the faithfulness. And that faithfulness that sustains us is precisely this, that the story of the book of Esther, where God is hidden, is he's hidden, but he's never, ever absent. You just have to take off the masks. You just have to see. He's just behind the scenes. He's there. And that's precisely why Purim is forever. Because the message that it teaches us more than anything else, as we read it in Psalm 16, is, I have set the Lord always before me. Surely he is at my right hand. I shall not falter. Therefore my heart is glad, and my glory rejoices. Therefore we celebrate Purim. God bless you.
Well, wasn't this a great day today? Yes. Woohoo! Let's give them one more big hand. Yay! All right.
Maybe people have things to say. People have been talking, so maybe people have...
Well, I have a few minutes here. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes.
Okay, just one second. Let me bring the mic back so people can hear you.
I got a question that refers to what to Esther, but it's not in Esther, and because Pastor Marcus told us that the fact that Haman was an Agagite.
It was a what?
Agagite.
Agagite. Oh, yeah,
refers
okay.
to King Agag.
We'll be talking about that tomorrow, but yes.
Oh, we are. Okay.
Oh, and how? Oh, boy.
Okay.
You betcha.
Because I was wondering, since Saul had said that he killed all the Amalekites except for the king,
Agag, right.
and then Samuel killed the king, that would leave no more Agagites left.
Well, you
to be
didn't
descended from him.
You didn't factor.
But there was an Agag in Numbers 24.
You didn't factor in what happened the night before Samuel slew Agag. When Agag left his legacy in some unsuspecting gal, and that's that tradition. That he perpetuated himself. Agag is the name of every king of Amalek, so that's why that's the name that appears in Numbers in the final prophecy of Balaam, and it's also Agag, whom we encounter in First Book of Samuel, chapter 15, and it's also Agag to whom Haman connects himself. It's all part of one continuum.
Okay, I
Connection. Yes.
I see where you were talking about, God being the author of everything, and he gives us this free will, and we see where on occasions like Balaam or a number of people have intent to do bad, and yet they get turned aside, it seems like against their own will. How is that possible?
It's an excellent question. And of course, first of all, note, it works in both directions. That is, when you consider the story of Pharaoh, this is an observation in our tradition that for the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh hardens his heart, and then from plague number 6 and on, we read that God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. So what does that mean? And while there are a number of different approaches to this question, I think the dominant one is, after plague number 5, Pharaoh was spiritually dead. But, that's precisely what God has Moses say to Pharaoh, albeit not after plague number 5, after plague number 6. Just as I, in plague number 5, killed off all the livestock, I could have killed you off too. So why have I left you around? He says to Pharaoh, in order to show you my might and in order to make my name known throughout the earth. In other words, previously, you, Pharaoh, were a human being. Now, you're a prop. You forfeited your right to be a human being. You are as good as dead. But you'll still hang around here because I'm going to use you as my prop in order to make the whole world know about God. That's a punishment. But it's a well-earned punishment. So he got punished.
So
I'll also, if I could also add one additional dimension here, and this is something that maybe has broader applications and could also do a good job of getting us all spooked. We read in Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1, as watercourses, so is the heart of a king in the hand of the Lord. To whatever he desires, he inclines him. In other words, there's another phenomenon here, which could really get us spooked. That is that when it comes to global things, God will ensure that his will be done. The free will of the king is limited because he is serving as God's agent whether he wants to or not. Of course, what we'll necessarily add here, and this is where we get spooked, is every nation gets the leaders it deserves. Ouch! Okay. Yes.
As a reader, I consider that God is very present in the book of Esther.
Absolutely, but that's because you're looking for him.
Okay.
And you should be, you're right.
Okay, because simply just the letter Aleph itself discusses who he is and what he is in the aspects of the letter itself and his silence and his strength and his
Again, I'm not going to disagree with you.
because no one mentions it, no one sees it. They don't. Well, sometimes he's not heard or seen, and he's not meant to be, but to know that he's there.
Absolutely, and just to appreciate. Obviously, the role of writing down the book of Esther is precisely to guide us to appreciating that God is there. Just to recognize, especially if we have been living through the events of the story over that decade or so that all these events are unfolding, we might well not have noticed anything. So we have this book that guides us to see. Can you now open up your eyes, see what's going on? 100%.
All right. Yay. We'll see you at 10 tomorrow morning.